Welcome. Today we end our short series on the Psalms. We began in week 1 with looking at Psalms of praise, which we said acted like a canopy, a covering over the community of faith, because they were there to remind us, or they are there to remind us, that God created the world, that the earth and everything in it belongs to the Lord, that the Lord is in charge, and that at the end of the day, He has His hand upon us and watches over us. In the midst of all the troubles of life, God's hand is upon us. And so in that sense, these Psalms, as the reminder, are canopy over us. And then for 2 weeks, we looked at Psalms of complaint, laments, and things like that. The Psalms which remind us that God's people are not exempt from the sufferings and difficulties of this world. And that at the end of the day, what God desires from us, perhaps more than anything, is our honesty in the midst of those challenges. Because honesty is an expression of love and trust. It's an expression of relationship. And so we spoke about the importance and the gift that kind of honesty can be to us and to the community. And we spoke about how destructive it can be to live a life of pretense. And now today we're back to Psalms of praise and thanksgiving, but these are different from the Psalms that we heard of in week 1. These Psalms are the ones that are written on the other side of some kind of trouble. That's the mark, that's the uniqueness of them. It's when the psalmist goes, life was good at some point, then some kind of tragedy or difficulty happened, and now I see some light emerging in the midst of my troubles. The hopelessness of the lament of the time of trouble is past, and now there's time for newness. And the psalm we read today, Psalm 30, was written by David after he had experienced a life-threatening illness. An illness which really, as we will see, shook him to his core. Now, I want to say that I absolutely love psalms like these, and I love them because they are their feet, as it were, are still rooted in some kind of suffering, if you like, some kind of reality. So we know that when the psalmist sings his praise, he's doing so with his eyes wide open. He's familiar with the realities of the world. He's not denying reality. His praise is not some kind of, as we see happen in the modern church so often, his praise is not some kind of cover-up or a desperate attempt to say all is well, when things quite obviously aren't. This psalmist, when he writes these kind of psalms, his hallelujahs are rooted in fact, they even emerge out of the troubles of his life and the goodness of God. And I mean that in the sense that it's not an either or, it's not one or the other, it's both and. These psalms are marked with both pain and praise. And those are by far my favorite kind of songs because for me, they brim with authenticity. And so I today want to just share 2 lessons. I wish I could share more, but we only have time for 2. 2 lessons that I think this kind of psalm can teach us. And the first of those lessons is I think they teach us about acceptance. Listen to a few verses, actually about 6 verses from the psalm, where the psalmist says, "As for me, I said in my prosperity, I shall never be moved. By your favor, O Lord, you had established me as a strong mountain." So the psalmist saying, and I'm going to repeat myself in a moment, but the psalmist is saying, life is good, life is secure, everything is in its place. And then he goes, you hid your face, which is the psalmist's way of saying, then I got sick, and at some level I think God is responsible for that. And so he clarifies, says, and I was dismayed. And then he turns to prayer in the midst of his trouble. He says, to you, O Lord, I cried, to the Lord I made supplications. And then we get insight into what his prayer was. And his prayer was, and we heard a bit of this last week, his prayer is, what profit is there in my death, Lord? He says, what good is there if I go down to the pit? In other words, if I end up in the grave. Remember, David was one of the Bible's great musicians, great singers, songwriters. And he says, will the dust praise you? Will it tell of your faithfulness? I mean, who's going to worship you if I'm dead? What benefit is there? Was his prayer. And so he says, hear, O Lord, and be gracious to me. O Lord, be my helper. And then clearly the change happens, and so he concludes, or moves to the conclusion in his psalm by saying, you have turned my mourning into dancing. You have taken off my sackcloth. You've clothed me with joy. You have intervened. In essence, at the risk of repeating myself, the psalmist says, I used to think my life was as solid as a rock. But clearly, this is his realization, clearly I was wrong about my life. The mountain of my life, what used to be the solid rock, came close to just being the dust of the grave. And now that goodness is coming back into the psalmist's life, now that he's emerged out of his illness, he's beginning to feel better again, life is beginning to feel normal. He discovers that his life and the way he sees his life is different. His troubles have taught him to see that his life isn't what he thought it used to be. He once thought he was invincible, but now he knows he isn't. The world in which he lives and the God that he worships, somehow they too are seen differently because of this experience. As many of you know, I've really struggled with the impact of COVID on the life of the church, but particularly on our church. And I continue to experience, and some of you know this, I continue to experience some real measure of pain at what we have lost as a church community. And I want to tell you, it isn't helped by people who chirp all the time about how things have changed. I keep getting reminded, and so I find myself, there's a significant part of me that continues to hanker for what used to be. But if this psalm teaches us anything, if the psalm encourages us to anything, it reminds us that there is no going back. There is no going back. Life has changed, trouble has come, and now it's a season for newness. I think what we often experience in life is we have, I hope this is helpful, that we have a season of goodness, let's call it A. And then we get into a time of trouble, and for the sake of illustration, let's call it B. And then I think what we long for is we long to go back to A again, to the way it exactly was before. And this is a deep human need within all of us, especially in the midst of grief. When we want to grasp for what once was, we want to hold on to the goodness that we used to know. It's very understandable. But for the psalmist, working through his complaints, working through his grief, working through his laments, he has come to the realization that he cannot get what he used to have back again. And so it can never be A, B, A. He recognizes it will now have to be A, B, C. Something different, something new. Of course, we can honor our past, we can remember our past, we can cherish our past. We give thanks to God for our past. But the reality of life is we cannot have it back. And without wanting to sound too much like the 70s song, even that's the title of our sermon, the psalmist can see clearly now that the pain is gone. And if not gone, it has subsided enough for him to recognize that new life is coming and the world is different. He has come to a place of acceptance of how life is. The Jesuit priest James Martin writes in his book, The Jesuit Guide to Everything, that God invites us to accept the inescapable realities placed in front of us. And that's not always easy, I recognize that. But that's the invitation of the psalm, to accept the inescapable realities that are placed in front of us. And we can either turn away from the acceptance of life and continue on our own, or we can plunge into the reality of the situation. In other words, we give ourselves completely to this new world the way it is, even if we don't like it. And we try to find God there in new ways. Martin says obedience in this case means accepting reality. Some of you might find it helpful for the reminder that Carl Jung, the famous psychiatrist, said what you deny controls you, and what you accept transforms you. And I think the psalmist had that wisdom 2,500 to 3,000 years ago. So acceptance. Then the second element that I think that this psalm teaches me, and I hope teaches us, is the importance of praise. Praise. Through his acceptance of the way things are, by no longer looking back to the past, no longer being bogged down in his misery, the psalmist is now freed to praise with an authentic praise. So he says, weeping may linger for the night. There's a season for weeping, but joy comes with the morning. The truth of the matter is we ought not to spend our lives in lament. We ought not to spend our lives in complaint. We are invited to worship. And so the psalmist goes on in verse 11. It says, you have turned my mourning into dancing. You have taken off my sackcloth and clothed me with joy. His complaining is now a different thing. It is now praise. And what is important in these words is for us to recognize that for the psalmist, he recognizes it's all been made possible because of God's intervention in his life. The psalmist doesn't say, and this is significant, or it's significant for me, it is significant. He doesn't say, I've decided to get over myself. I decided to pull myself together, or as we like to say, pull myself towards myself. There's none of that sense of, if you like, self-help. He's clear, you have turned my life around. It's also none of this time heals all wounds nonsense that we hear floating around in common conversation. It's not time which does the healing. For the psalmist, it's quite clear who has turned things around for him and why his life has newness to it. And as he acknowledges that it is God who has been at work in his life, it is God who is bringing the newness into his life, it is God who will make sense for him of the loss of what he used to have and make sense of the trouble he's been through, and now brings new life to him. In the midst of all of that, he is filled with this deep gratitude. And so the last line of the psalm is, O Lord my God, I will give thanks to you. And it's these last two words I want us to see. I will give thanks to you forever. That's a big promise. It's a big promise. I will give thanks to you. So deep is his gratitude. I'll give thanks to you forever. I want to say, as we begin to close, is whenever we pray the Psalms, whichever Psalms we are praying, at the end of the day, we need to know that the Psalms are always going to call us. They're always going to beckon us to be worshippers. I'm not always sure, and I don't mean to be judgmental, it's just my sense of going, I'm not always sure that we as the wider church grasp the depths and the importance of our worshipping together. It's easy when we worship together for worship to just be a sing-along, or in churches where they've got fancy bands and flashing lights, just to be some form of Christian entertainment with a quick motivational talk. But the first commandment, right from the very beginning of our story in the Christian journey, the first commandment is a commandment for us to worship. And therefore worship is the first work of the church. That's our highest priority. Above all else, and I really mean that, above all else we are to be a worshiping community. Everything we are, everything we do, I promise you, everything we are, everything we do is determined by our worship, and particularly our gathered worship of God. So as I conclude this short series on the Psalms, my deep, deep prayer, and it really is, it's a sincere, deep prayer, is that we will not only become more devoted readers of the Psalms, because I hope I've made some argument for the importance of them over the last weeks. And so I hope that we will not only become devoted readers of the Psalms in our devotions and in our public worship, but I deeply pray that we will begin to experience as a community and as individuals, but as a community, the power of the Psalms at work in our lives. Because I'm convinced that if there's a community committed to being Psalm readers and Psalm prayers, that we will see a change within the community. And that I pray that as these ancient prayers do their work within us, that we will find, amongst other things, a deeper honesty before God, again in our public worship and in our private worship. I pray that we'll find worship which is marked by an earthy authenticity, a truthfulness, no fluffy cover-up stuff, but just a real, beautiful authenticity. And that we will find as a result of our investment in these Psalms a people who long to praise God, really a people who long to worship God, that we come to worship on a Sunday with a deep longing and need within our heart to worship God, a people who know what it is to have your souls refreshed in worship, to feel the sense of a refreshing when we worship God, not just singing some songs, but we feel the refreshing work of God in our worship. And that we will also find in the midst of all of that a liberty in our worship which frees people to laugh and to dance and to rejoice before the Lord, just as David discovered for himself. Let me close with the words of the psalm. You, Lord, have turned my mourning into dancing. You have taken off my sackcloth and clothed me with joy, so that my soul may praise you and not be silent. O Lord my God, I will give thanks to you forever.